of a little manifesto, a call to arms. If you get the chance to hog the floor and it didn't have to go through peer review first, then you should say what you want to say, which is what I do want to talk about. I want to talk about the power of the theoretical lens we use, practice theory, to explain phenomena, but potentially also to help us to intervene in those important societal phenomena. And I know it's 2 hours on the program, but there's just no way anyone wants to sit here for 2 hours. So it will be something like 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion, and I'd love to hear from you. So, okay, so we are in a troubling world, it has to be said. The future that was distant is, in all honesty, here right now. None of these are very old pictures. These are all things that are happening actually right now or in the last few years. These kinds of catastrophic events, and they are in different countries around the world, from developing and emerging economies to so-called advanced economies. So I think we have to accept that the literature on polycrisis and all of these things certainly has a point, that we are in a time of what are called grand challenges, extreme contexts, and so forth. And within that, I think we have also begun to question, what is the role of the business school? And I want to bring this up because it caught my attention when I saw it in the Financial Times, that there are many things that are catastrophic for humanity without being catastrophic for finance. And I thought, isn't that sort of where I came from as a strategy scholar at the start of my career? It was all about, how can we help firms? And I want to say up front, I'm here to say I actually think we need the market and we need the firm. So I'm not against either of those things. I'm not an anti-strategy scholar. All I'm saying is we need to start questioning some of those things, including whether something can be catastrophic for humanity and not catastrophic for finance. So let me talk you through what I'm feeling. And I think, obsessed, I did think, should I just say focused on? Concerned with, but I think obsessed with is fair enough. I used to call it the 7-year itch, this desire of ours to have more rigour, more relevance, and I traced it back to sort of some 1972 ASQ piece. But I think that we've stopped it being a 7-year itch, and we are obsessed with grand challenges. So what are grand challenges? I mean, we know something about them, but for those of you who it might be new, this language, these are those large, intractable things that affect big populations, that are non-linear, they're uncertain, they're beyond the organisation, and they are societally important. Big area of literature, including it's attracted lots of criticism. You know you've made it when you're criticised. Extreme contexts. These are contexts that exceed the capacity to prevent them happening. And I think, I love this, result in an extensive, intolerable magnitude of physical, psychological or material consequences that may be unbearable. Look back to those photos I put up before. Some of them are the catastrophic event. Some are the human beings being carried out of it or sitting in despair outside a home they will never occupy again. Unbearable. We're also, fortunately, thinking about what can we do about this. There's a literature increasingly growing on future making. And there's lots of definitions of it, including some in this room, done by people in this room. But this making sense of possible and probable futures and giving form to, ideally, those that we feel are more desirable. At the same time, there's an increasing call for phenomenon-based theorizing. I bow to Jean Bartunek, who brought this up for us in AMR, that theory should be phenomenon-driven. But increasingly we see this in, AMJ editorials and so forth saying, let's capture, describe, and document phenomena, yes, to conceptualize it, but also to make the bridge between academic research and management practice. And in that, of course, leads me to my next point, which is to have impact. And there are so many ways, as I said, it used to be the 7-year itch, and now it's kind of an outstring, if you like, in terms of responsible research and management by the Fellows of the Academy, engaged scholarship, God bless him, Andy van der Ven, rigour, relevance, and I wanted to give the Impact Scholar community a little shout out because this is on their website. When our research changes how organisations and decision makers think and act, and when we have used our role as academics to foster positive change, beyond our immediate research findings. And I just want to give them a shout out because actually the impact scholar community remind me of the practice community when we were starting out. You know, we were nothing and we were trying and we were building capacity, and then the paradox community when they were starting out, and we're all established now, so, you know, they're getting to be established too. So why do I think that, let me just turn this thing towards me so I can look at you guys instead of look at my stuff. So why do I think that practice theory is a way to offer answers? Because aren't each of these a body of theory in themselves? Do we need practice theory for this? And I hope that I can convince you we do. Because practice theory is a grand theory. By that we mean it's one of these theories that explains how the social world works. And, you know, it doesn't matter which of these many or other practice theorists you draw upon, all of them are a grand theory of the way the world works. They are not intended to have one-to-one correspondence with, you know, everyday life. Yet in that, and this is what I think is special about practice theory compared to some other grand theories, is it has not fallen into the trap of abstract conceptualization. So practice theory is a theory of how do we, instead of becoming detached from reality to abstract, it is how do we theorize from the messiness of the everyday. So I think this offers us the things that we may want to see. Let me give you the three ontological premises. I want to get the theoretical stuff over first. For some of you, I'm speaking too simply and I'm preaching to the converted. But for some of you, hopefully this is new. You're just coming into practice theory and thinking, is this for me? It could be for you because it's mundane. And all of us can do things that are mundane. Okay, and by that I mean that it's concerned with those in-the-moment little things we do every day, that our participants do every day, that they take for granted, that they may themselves be not aware of. And these are these doings, sayings, material arrangements, and I want to bring out this issue of not being aware of it is action is purposive, as in we do things practically to solve everyday things that face us. We're not without purpose, we're purposive. But one way of thinking about practice theory is we're not purposeful, that everyday mundane actions are not goal-directed towards some big thing, and I might try to rearrange and complicate that a little bit later, but this idea that in those mundane things that we don't even think about, that we take for granted, that is where we start with ordering the social world. And I think that is the key point. Because mundane practice is not, therefore, uninteresting. Mundane practice is consequential. If it is what we do every day and it is taken for granted and not thought about and yet purposively keeps constructing patterns, what could be more consequential than that which we do without even knowing that we do it? And in that sense, it's, and you know, there are various ways of thinking about that, but this notion that all these moments are in a continuous flow of becoming. They're constructing the pattern that is the social order, and nothing could be more consequential than the pattern that is the social order. So that's point two. The third point is we need to understand these things because these mundane but consequential actions are the source of both social stability and also change. And it's very important that we understand what is being stabilized and what is perhaps unintentionally being changed, or what is available to be intervened into change, because these patterns are constructed across time and space. They're often taken for granted and not noticed. And in doing so, they reconstruct the patterns of power and privilege that are the things that exacerbate the inequities and that produce and reproduce the patterns for the more privileged and the more powerful. And I think we've seen a lot of work. I give a shout out to Catherine Satter's work and her co-authors, Martha Feldman and Brian Pentland's work, who have really tried to make us think about inequities as they stem from these mundane practices. But I didn't want to put just a couple of names in here because, quite frankly, who do I attribute this to? I mean, it's everybody, right? It's all of us doing practice-based theorizing. So thank you all. I'm citing you all for these three ontological principles. And in that, we also have methodological premises. And this is where practice theory is not just a grand theory, but also allows us some way of getting to the messy realities of everyday life. It's true. When you read some of these grand theorists who are our social practice theorists, you need to be still in your PhD and very much in love with theory, because they are a bit convoluted. But when you tear them apart, they really can help you to understand and do analysis. Because the first thing is they eschew levels. So where we got, stuff on, still, our universities advertise for a micro person or a macro person. I don't know what a micro person is. Is it a very little person? But in that sense, we still somehow believe in levels. And yet this theorizing says levels are not where it's at, because that assumes automatically that something that is higher level is bigger, more important, more something. Okay, but we eschew levels in favour of a texture of practices. And you go, texture of practices, well, how am I going to study that? I can study a level. Fortunately, you can study that, and a lot of people in this room, and some who were unable to make it for a series of reasons, which are multiple, at this academy, have shown us that we can. So one of the things is that these texture of practices can be operationalised as sites. And what are sites? They are a nexus of practices where things exist and events happen. And what I think is really great about that is it doesn't say a site is a place, a location. It is where things exist and events happen, and those are constructed in these mundane practices in multiple places. Because then that's the other point. That a site is not one place, it's dispersed across time and space. A site stretches. And because of that, we can go from very specific, localised, mundane things that we may study in our own research sites. I'm going to try and operationalise this a bit more concretely shortly, but let's get the theory over with first. So this issue that they are localised, they are specific, they are mundane, and you can do that. You can go into an organisation, you can go into the field, and you can study the mundane things happening there. But you can also connect that to the large-scale phenomena, the patterns, the consequentiality, the things that are grand and extreme. And there's lots of ways you can do that. We fortunately have a lot of thoughts about that. We have Shatsky, who I think is a very practical practice theorist, if you like. You can really use his stuff. He's got a lot of tools in there. Stretching sideways, so sides stretch sideways. We've got Nicolini, who zooming in and out, sorry about that, zooming in and out. Girardi, the web of practices. Micro-authors, Bednarik and Spianai, nested relationality, these relationships between sites that are nested in each other. So all of this can actually be done empirically, and you probably already do it empirically, even if you don't know you do. So what I would say is that this is why practice theory allows us to address current calls in management theory. And if you think about what we're obsessed with the grand challenges, we're obsessed with the stream context, because we know that those fires, those floods, those people forced out of homes, and the polarization that creates, and the refugee streams, and the homelessness, and the poverty and the famine that creates, that those are consequential things. But how do you start there? Whereas practice theory says you can start from the mundane. It would have started from the mundane, and you can trace that to get to the grand. It also helps us to think about what futures we want to make, because it is performative. Okay, we are performing the future every day in the present. If you don't like the pictures I put up at the start, we have performed that future. It didn't just happen. Mundane practices performed that future and continue to perform that future in the present until we reimagine how it is that we might perform everyday practice. So, and this I give to my colleague Rebecca Bednarik in an email only very recently. We need to think of ourselves like this, and I'm sorry for those of you who are arachnophobic, researchers who are situated in this web. And so we can perceive these connections that are, that are not levels, that are, how do we go sideways? How do we zoom in and out? if you are immersed in a context, and that is what practice theory really is, it's often ethnographic, or you become so knowledgeable in an area that it doesn't even need to be ethnographic. You are a member of your field, if you see what I mean. Then, like a spider, you know what to attend to because you feel the vibrations in the web that you are immersed in. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that's occurred for me, because that situatedness, that being able to sense through the immersion in the field that is core to practice theorizing and to practice ways of doing research, shapes the phenomena you pay attention to. And if we are doing phenomena-based theorizing, and I hope we will do more of it, phenomena-based theorizing, not theory about phenomena, then that situatedness, that being in the web, is where we find the phenomena to look at. So as part of that, one of the joys of doing a keynote, you get to talk about your own stuff. But I'd like to give you an example that is, and I'm going to give it to you in a personal way, because that's the point, right, of us being in the web. So I want to talk about this notion of natural disasters. It used to be a thing. You talked about natural disasters. They were disasters that were caused by, seismic events and extreme weather events. In the humanitarian and disaster community, it is no longer okay to call them natural disasters. I'm going to show you why. It is, in fact, in the insurance sector, still fine. We call them natural catastrophes. What I want to convince you of is that, well, A, labels matter, and they're not very natural. So I'm going to tell you this story in this way. I'm going to tell you about how disasters, seemingly disastrous things that are natural, escalate. So in 1974, I was a child. I'm not telling you exactly how old a child I was, because some of you, maybe qualitative, can do a bit of maths. But I was a child, and I lived in Brisbane in a very floody suburb called Yeronga. And there was a catastrophic flood. It didn't flood our home, but my mother went to do part of the cleanup. I didn't go to do part of the cleanup. I was not very big. But I remember the smell on my mother when she came back and how she talked about it from people we knew. Scraping the mud of ceilings, nothing being left in the house that was even usable. And how do you bring these people back into this house and, could you find them something that was like what they had before so that they would, be going. And so there's something visceral about the smell of a flood on your mother. Anyway, that was one flood, 1974. Apparently, it was because we didn't have dams. Okay, no problem. Because then there was another one in 2011. And that was kind of odd because we built the dams. Since the flood was because we didn't have the dams, we built the dams. And the one in 2011 went to 17 metres in the city that I live in. I don't know what city you live in, I don't know what floor your house is on, but just think about 17 metres of water rising. Are you safe? Because, anyway, we did have the dams, but it turns out that they didn't let the water out of the dams in time. And in fact, a class action was taken against the water companies. So a lot of lawyers made a lot of money getting people together for a class action. Just in time for that class action to be dismissed in 2022, when I had not long come back to Australia to live in Brisbane after more than 30 years away. Let's again not do too much maths. And I watched over 3 days. I had asked the estate agents to find me a house that was above the flood. I wanted an apartment. They took me to all these apartments, and I'm like, why are you taking me to this apartment? You know this floods. Oh, yeah, I know the apartment doesn't flood. It's on the 6th floor. But you know the building floods. Oh, yeah, but that was because we didn't have the dam, and we got the dam. And I said, I was here in 1974. Show me a place that doesn't flood. I can read a flood map. So, luckily, I bought above the floods. But I watched a year's worth of landfill go past my home in 3 days. Devastating the beautiful bay where the dugongs live and the turtles live. Devastating not just the dugongs and the turtles, but the people who lived where the flood rises. And we did have the dams, and we did let the water out of the dams. So, wasn't the dams. And yet, each time that this happened, we were blindsided by the disaster and its consequences. And one of the things I want to alert you to is, when we study a grand challenge or an extreme context, we want to focus on one of those starbursts. And who wouldn't want to focus on a starburst, right? They're beautiful, they're exciting, they're important. Who doesn't want to talk about, I was there for the disaster? But actually what I did is I went back and read a book by Margaret Cook. She's a water historian. I don't know if you know that there are these things. She's a water historian and she has done a history of that river since first settlement came, including sort of early historical notes which showed that people settled on this river because it would be good for transporting things, and that the indigenous people, in the goodness of their hearts, tried to explain to these weird incomers that the water comes here, and they tried to show them where their form of permanent structures were right up here. But we built in the river, because for them, that is the river. Sometimes the river is here, sometimes the river is there, but it is all the river. And so her book is beautiful because it is a river with a city problem. The river was there first, and she shows all the floods and all the knowledge of the floods and all the times we ignored it, and we built a technocratic solution and another technocratic solution, because each time it wasn't that we lived in the river, it was that the river needed to be controlled. And, well, we see how that worked, right? Because there we were in 2022, flooded again. So what I would say to you is, there is an accretion of mundane practices by which those disasters became disasters. And the indigenous people already told us, if you build there with a permanent structure, it ain't gonna work. Okay, so everyday practices that seem sensible in those terms predispose to disasters. And practice theory can help you think differently. Instead of thinking about the extreme moment, the disaster, think about all the things that made it extreme and turned it into the disaster. Because it was a disaster in waiting in mundane practices before it ever happened. So, how should we do this? Let me talk to you about our careers. Our careers are long. Mine has been going for a little while now. There are a few people in this room who I see there's also been going for a little while now. So academic careers have a long trajectory. So we can build research in specific sites because no one can do everything at once. And then we connect the site of one project to the next project and the next project over the course of a trajectory. For those of you who are early career, think about what is it that I do next and why and how does it connect to what I'm doing now? Because our sites of research we can see as a practice as well. Each of them can embrace dispersion across, to really try to understand the phenomena we are researching by expanding sideways, and then join the next project to the existing project so that you can start to tell a bigger story about that issue I showed you of when something becomes severe through the accretion of practices. And so why should we do this? I mean, isn't our job just to get some papers, ideally in the 6 amazing journals or the 10 amazing journals, or I think there's a new 50 journals in the FT, right? So maybe isn't that our job? I don't think so. I think our job is to generate complete explanations of phenomena that demystify why they seem grand or extreme. To do this, we need to do some fairly mundane research that is often purposive, focused on what's happening in the moment at the time and solving the problems there. Let me show you how that's led me to understand things I honestly never thought I would even look at when I was a doctoral student. I mean, it just never occurred to me. I mean, I was really happy doing strategist practice. I love the theory, but it just never occurred to me. But you sense these things. So I want to talk to you about the work on making a market for acts of God. This is the reinsurance market. I fell across it serendipitously, but it is the market that pays for large-scale catastrophes around the world. So, when the earthquake happens, when the big fire comes, when the flood comes, it's the capital that pays to rebuild. So it's an important market. I had the opportunity to study this initially in London and Bermuda, and what that taught me is that we needed to stretch sideways. A global market is not London and Bermuda, it is global. So we persuaded various people to give us a little bit more funding, and we all agreed to live very scarcely in order to collect the data to do that. And here I particularly thank my co-authors, Rebecca Bednarek and Paul Speed. because we found these 4 sites that explain, we used Shatsky deliberately, purposively. If you want to know how to use practice theory purposively, just look at, you don't look at chapter 2, you don't need to read the book to understand how to use it to come up with sites and understand how to operationalise them and relate them to each other. Now, from that, we came up with a new theory of the market. So theories of the market were about embodied presence, having developed from the open outcry markets, with bodies and bellies. Read the loom, it's amazing. The bellies of them as they wave, their hands. Embodied markets, and as we shifted from those to response markets, the electronic markets, the ticker tape, the trading markets. But this is a market that is neither of those. It is relational presence that we theorise, that these practices by people who don't see each other, don't know each other, and don't even see all the risks, are able to place global capital that will come to make your country good after the flood through these practices that incorporate other within them and are entangled. So you can trace it and you can explain a market. I'm proud of the theory, but I'm proud of something else a little bit more, which is, so what? So it's a capital market. Capital is agnostic. Capital doesn't come because it cares about an earthquake in Haiti. Capital doesn't come because it cares about a flood in Germany. It doesn't come because it cares about a wildfire in California. It comes because it's agnostic. And if it can make money out of it, then it will do so. And in return for the money it makes, it will pay for things after disaster. Everything from immediate post-disaster relief, clean water, temporary shelter, food, so important. And the market can pay for that. But also big things, longer-term reconstructions of the homes and businesses that were destroyed. And as part of that, one of the things that was in our data was a very grand challenge, rebuilding New York City after the World Trade Center. The Moody's reports of that, after they add it all up, are $47 billion in insured loss. The reinsurance market paid out on that. Really an important thing. Hey, that's a lot of money. Yeah, and that's in those days' dollars, not today's dollars. So it's really important, this market, because it allows something like that to be something that you can recover from and that you can rebuild. So I think that's important, and that's what I'm proud of, that I show you how a market that actually, while it is agnostic, it is faceless, it is just capital, it exists to make profit, that profit can do a lot of good. That said, what it shows you, and this is where practice theory is beautiful, is that's one pattern. It's the market pattern. But there are things that are beyond the market pattern. Now, economists will tell you, oh, is there market failure? And well, there's no market failure here because there is still a market. Yeah, wrong question. There are things that are beyond the market pattern. The market has not failed. It can still do things, but things you need done are beyond the market pattern. And what we saw is that the World Trade Center showed the reinsurance sector, and therefore the insurance sector, and therefore all those things like building and construction that rely on insurance to operate, that terrorism on the scale of the World Trade Center was beyond the market pattern. So something had to be done because, yes, they paid out, they didn't collapse, but they very nearly collapsed. And so they refused to take terrorism anymore because they're a market and it is beyond the market pattern. Not a market failure, beyond the pattern. And if we think like practice theorists, we don't think about market failure. We think, no, the market's doing what the market should do. Its pattern is fine. This is beyond the market pattern. So my colleagues, Eugenia Cacciatore, Konstantinos Chalkias and Rebecca Bednarek, set out to discover what happens when it goes beyond the market pattern. What's the next pattern we should see? And we knew that there were, because ad hoc things came up to allow terrorism insurance and reinsurance to persist, because you couldn't have rebuilt New York if you couldn't get insurance. I mean, you can't go and do construction if you don't have insurance. I mean, what happens if someone gets hurt on the construction site? We all want insurance to be there, right? Because it'll pay for their medical care. If they have lifetime disabilities, it will pay for them for life. Yeah, so it's, you need something. So these things came up, and we discovered that there were others of them, and we looked at 17 of them operating in 47 countries around the world. And we understood that this was important because what we saw from the World Trade Center is that without this market, which is agnostic and only provides its capital within the pattern that is right for it, then you lose liquidity, you can't build, your economy is static, and particularly when you get things like the things I showed you, the floods, the fires, the famines, what you drive is a burden on the public purse, which therefore cannot be spent on other things, and particularly you drive a burden on the individual who is harmed. So we thought, okay, this is pretty important. Let's go and look at these things that try to do something about that when the market pattern fails. And so we found around the world these ad hoc things that were operating in these different countries. They were all localised. They hadn't come up to solve the market pattern. They'd come up to solve the fact that the market pattern didn't fit in their local context, so they did something about it. They were purposive. They weren't trying to solve the market. They were purposively just trying to solve something in their countries. But we were able to link them together because, hey, practice theory, we use some paradox theory here as well. Practice theory says to you, they're not each some different thing, they're connected sites. And we looked at them as how they're connected through these practices of responding to imbalances in who's responsible for disaster. Is it that individual who owns the property? Is it the individual who got hurt on the building site? Or is it the collective, and who is that collective? So that's one problem. The other is that we know disasters are getting more severe, and we know where they're going to get more severe. And we know it's going to cost a lot more, and that's problematic for a market because it's agnostic, but it has to make profit. So it knows it's going to get worse, but it doesn't know how it's going to get worse and how much it's going to cost. So it can't really address that. And finally, who should control this market? Who is the market for? Is it a market for social good or a market for capital? And so I want to tell you this book, we didn't write it for an academic audience. We thought that an academic audience would certainly read it. It's beautifully informed by theory. Thank you, theory, for helping us write a book for policymakers and practitioners. And we got a grant so that we could make it open access so that we could give it away. We wanted to give it away because we had gone and talked to people in emerging economies and all kinds of people. And we worked really hard to make it in this market and this problem intelligible so other people could use it. And so we drew little pictures like this to sort of show, this is what I call, and I'll show you a bit more of this, in vivo theorizing. We did come up with a theory, of course, because we're academics and because theory is good. Okay, we thought of these things as continually operating at the edge of disequilibrium, continuously reconstructing their pattern at the forefront of where the problem was. But that showed us that the pattern that they had was also insufficient. So they were ad hoc local solutions, they certainly had a patterned way of acting, but there was something beyond the PGE pattern. So when I talk about you see a pattern, you go sideways, we saw it, and then we saw, it's not enough, it's a new pattern. Because these things bridge a financial protection gap, right? They came in because insurance stopped working. And so they build a bridge over the financial problem. But if the disaster problem keeps growing, the bridge has to keep stretching and stretching, and it will break. And of course, actually a lot of them really know that, whether they have the power to do anything about it. And this is the thing, to build a sustainable pattern in which a market will work for disasters, then they need a means to actually reduce the risk that a disaster will happen in the first place. So we came up with a nice little heuristic for them, which is this idea, in vivo theorizing, if you like, theorizing for the field, which is that if all they do is patch up insurance, they actually create a maladaptation because they bring something back to where it was, the broken house, the problematic thing. They build it back to where it was. And that is one definition of resilience. How quickly can you go from a deficit to getting back to where you were? That's one definition. And if you're the person who's out of your house, and that can happen quickly, believe me, that's a nice definition. That said, it was already not fit for purpose in a changing world. So what we needed was to think about how could they have the ability to do wider systems over the longer term. How could they go from maladaptation to climate adaptation? And that's where we finished the book, talking about what's the next pattern that needs to be understood. And the next pattern came to me on my balcony in February 2022 as I watched the disaster flow past my house. I just had to know, because can we do something about that? Because I know it keeps happening. So here's the phenomena. In late 2021 through to September 2022, across the east coast of Australia, it was we had 3 La Ninas in a row, which is, the wet cycles. And there was a series of catastrophic floods. Let me give you a few figures for just that 1 year of them. Insured losses, depending how you count, 6.3 to 7.7 billion Australian dollars. Government disaster relief. Now, disaster relief, that's a big amount, because disaster relief is just that little bit of money you give people straight after the disaster. Something so that, they can buy groceries, because, some people have 0 hours contracts. They need to buy groceries, they can't go to work, the schools are closed, they've got to do something. So a little bit of money to some business, that's just disaster relief. It's not doing anything to change disaster. Then, important money. Disaster recovery funding, something to actually let us recover from the disaster and hopefully do so in a more resilient way. So 7.45 billion. And then this is a 2024 parliamentary report. I actually put in a little bit of contribution to the report. Not on the figures, you can imagine that, I'm not an economist, but lost economic activity of around 5 billion is what is calculated from just that one catastrophic event. So in total, we're talking around 23.5 billion. Okay, so maybe that doesn't seem like a lot to some very rich economies. I tell you, we're a wealthy country still, thank God, but we're a small population. That's a lot of money in 1 year. And I want to point out to you, I like insurance. It paid a third of that bill at least, so that's something, because there is no money tree. The rest just had to come from the public purse, and that means us, the people. We the people, huh? So anyway, I really wanted to be part of this, and I managed to get funding to evaluate the way that one really special fund was created. So proactive. We're going to use some of the disaster recovery funding to actually improve future resilience. 1.6 billion on voluntary home buyback from flood areas, home raising, lifting houses up. My God, some of these houses, you don't want to have to carry shopping and a baby up those stairs. Resilient retrofit, which is like to make it quicker to clean up and get back into after the disaster, and some which is assisted relocation, taking whole communities and relocating them somewhere else away from the flood. So 1.6 billion, a fantastic big natural experiment, and I got the right to bring a team together to study that. So is it successful? We're halfway through. We've studied one state that was the first state to do it, and they're close to finished. They thought they'd be finished in 2 years. Here we are 5 years later, and they keep extending the deadlines, because recovery and reconstruction are hard. But is it successful? Yes. Thousands of homes are more resilient and their homeowners are safer. So that's really great. That said, well, thousands, that's not really shifting the dial. That's my first point. Thousands sounds good. And for those thousands, that's great. Let's not talk about the hundreds of thousands we might need to do this with. Also, beyond the pattern. Straight away, we began to see beyond the pattern. This thing was beautiful. It was generous. I mean, there was a lot of money pumped, of public money pumped into private assets, people's homes. But beyond the pattern, and again, look at these little in vivo theorizings, little frameworks we developed for them, we began to see that actually it can't account for individuals and post-disaster inequity. So here are things, you've lost your home. Remember some of those early photos I showed you? There's a guy just sitting there outside his totally ruined house. Everything's been dragged out. And he's just dispirited. You can't even get rental after a flood because there is nowhere to rent. So, they want us to make decisions on our houses and give us money to tell us to do something when we're just trying to find somewhere to live. And then you have all these cascadingness of mundaneness. People have everyday lives. They have a job and a kid and a this and a that. And the flood then creates this thing of, I was working. The flood stuffed that up because I lost my car. So then I lost my job. And then I'm a single parent. So then, and I have a child with disabilities. So that person can't make use of this beautiful thing that we set up. The thing that was beyond the pattern, which was to make them more resilient, there is beyond that pattern again. And so I started to look at this and to think, well, actually, where are the individuals and the communities that need to be part of this? We've got a big chunk of government money. We got a pretty substantial, a third of the chunk of industry, insurance industry money. So obviously they're at the table in the decisions. But where are the people who bear the biggest brunt of all? The homeowners. So I thought, well, you know, that's the next pattern. But the good news is I'm not going to talk to you about the next pattern because this actually isn't about my research. This is just saying, can you see how serendipitously and purposively you stretch through one pattern and it brings you to the exhaustion of that pattern for the problem that you want to study? I wouldn't say that, you know, a lot of us do this, but certainly some of us do this. And I'm just going to give you one other example because it stayed with me early in my career, which is this Denis, Lamoth and Langley paper in 2001 on pluralism.